You're listening to the Colin Flaherty Don't Make the Black Kids Angry podcast. Didn't it seem like Elizabeth Warren was going to get away with that whole fake Indian thing? You know, the fake Indian designation she gave to herself to help her get a job. The fake Indian thing that helped her keep the job. The fake Indian thing that helped her get promoted up to Harvard. The fake Indian thing that helped her publish a recipe, her fake Indian recipe in a fake Indian recipe book. Oh yeah, it turned out that recipe, yeah, that was plagiarized. And, you know, a lot of people were screaming about this. Last time she was up for election, a lot of people were screaming about it since then. But it didn't really get any traction until Trump took it up. Until Trump started reminding people how ridiculous this whole thing was. Wow, what a lesson for us. Anyway, but she's not even the craziest one out there. She is not the craziest one in the U.S. Senate for telling fairy tale stories about her own life that helped her get elected. That honor belongs to Cory Booker. Senator Cory Booker, the Democratic senator from the state of New Jersey. He's a Democrat. So here's what we know about Cory Booker. He kind of had the Obama thing going. He went to a big shot law school, moved back to Newark, New Jersey. We're going to get in all that because there's a couple of really crazy stories about it. But why don't we start off with the thing that we've talked about here many times before, and it just happened again a few weeks ago in the Senate. Cory Booker was grilling a nominee for judge, and they had the following exchange.
I understand the case McCleskey versus Kemp, which demonstrated significant compelling evidence that implicit racial bias has an impact in the judicial system. But yet they threw it out as a factor for deciding on in this case, on death penalty cases. And I'm just curious, do you think implicit racial bias exists in our criminal justice system?
I apologize, Senator. I'm not familiar with the case. I would indicate only that I would do my very best as a judge to ensure that no biases came in.
You're aware that African Americans are stopped more than whites for drug searches in this country, that there's no difference between blacks and whites for using drugs or dealing drugs, but they're 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for it. You're aware of the data, I imagine, that says that African Americans are more likely to get mandatory minimum sentences for the same crime. You're probably aware of the data that African Americans are more likely to serve more times for similar crimes. Do you think implicit racial bias exists in the justice system as you know it?
One of the things I can say, Senator, is that I want to put my pro bono efforts into...
I'm not asking about you specifically, sir. I'm asking, do you think racial bias exists in the criminal justice system?
I can't be in a position, Senator, of under the canons of ethics of taking positions until I would be able to do it.
Sir, I'm sorry. The data and the evidence is profound. I've had Republican nominees, Democratic nominees, FBI leaders in hearings I've had simply point out the fact that in the United States of America, implicit racial bias impacts the criminal justice system. And you have no opinion whether on the facts or no assessment whether racial bias exists in the American criminal justice system.
I try to put my time and effort into those areas where I think it would have an impact. For example, for the Federal Defender's Office in Wisconsin.
That's not the question I'm asking, sir. I'm asking yes or no. Do you think racial bias, implicit racial bias, exists in the criminal justice system? Yes or no?
I would indicate, Senator, absolutely. If I could take a look at all those statistics and studies that you would take, I would be able to be in a position to offer.
And you haven't? You're a judge in the United States of America, and you have not looked at issues of race in sentencing the criminal justice. I'm sorry, I know I'm over my time, Mr. Chairman. I find this astonishing.
On this podcast and on my channels and in my books, we talk about the greatest lie of our generation, the myth, the hoax of black victimization. The fairy tale that black people are relentless victims of relentless white racism all the time, everywhere. That explains everything. That's what we just saw there. And it's weird because that's the second example of that we've seen in a couple days, right? The first was the other night on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. Leslie Stahl was asking the Secretary of Education. We did a podcast on this, so I'll just go over it briefly. She said, hey, what about civil rights? Everybody knows that if you have a bunch of white kids horsing around, they go down to the principal's office. If you have a bunch of black kids doing the same thing, we call the cops. This is an article of faith among everybody who worked for the Obama administration for 8 years. They looked at everything through the lens of race, everything through the lens of relentless white racism and disparity of any kind in school between black children and white children. And if you throw Asian children there, that blows everything up too, right? Any disparity is proof positive of white racism. So Corey was playing that card there. But to me, what really got my attention, but he's not the first one to play it, right? Everybody in the Black Caucus talks about that all the time. Black people and white people commit the same amount of crime, but only black people get arrested, white people get off. The same argument they make at school, they go right outside the door of the school and they make in the neighborhoods, in the community. I mean, here's a quote from a guy, a black congressman named Robert Scott. He's from Virginia. The war on drugs has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Even though data shows that minorities are no more likely to use drugs or commit crimes. Wow. That's from a congressman. He's saying that in his capacity as a congressman. Complete with richly paneled wood all around, big elevated stage, dais, lots of adoring reporters and hangers-on in the audience hanging on his every word. He wasn't the only one to say it. John Conyers said the same thing. He talks about the continuing prevalence of racism as the only reason that black people are getting arrested here. We like now to think, says Congressman Conyers, he's the guy that just got kicked out of office a few months ago. We like now to think our justice is colorblind, that our system is race neutral. But whether overt or subconscious, the vestiges of racism are still reflected in sentencing. Now we're paraphrasing. 1 in 9 black men are between the ages of 20 and 34 are incarcerated. 1 in 3 black men and 1 in 6 Latinos will spend some time of their lives in prison, compared to 1 in 23 white men. Wow. He presses on. Quote, blacks represent 12% of total drug users in the country, but account for 40% of people doing time for drugs. Wrong, 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 fail. But he pressed on to say, before we identify solutions, we must recognize how we institutionalize and normalize racism today. So what Cory Booker said to that judge was the same thing that Conyers was saying. Everybody should have known that question was coming, just like Betsy DeVos totally was unprepared. Either unprepared, unwilling, or just not brave enough to give the answer to say that black people are committing crime, violence, and mayhem in disproportionate numbers in schools and outside of school. That's what that same thing the judge had to do. The judge totally backed off it. Listen, is this what we're going to do for the next 7 years of the Trump administration? The blood's in the water now. Everybody knows these last 2 days. Message. All you have to do is shove the racism card in their face. And they will cower like little baby girls. Quote Conyers, I want to focus on how racism, unconscious or not, has a disproportionate impact on criminal penalties in minority communities. Bias can begin on decisions about what offenses are investigated. Here comes the money quote, right? With enough time and officers in a certain location, it is only a matter of time before they find reasonable suspicion to stop, detain, and arrest someone or many people. So, when we talk about the great lie, the great hoax here, we also know that the great lie is built up of lots of little lies supporting it. And there's no little lie that has been unchallenged more, that has gotten wider spread, has been spread more widely than the hoax, the myth, the fairy tale that white people and black people use the same amount of drugs, illegal drugs. But only black people get arrested while white people get slapped on the wrist and poked in the ribs and said, hey man, have a good buzz. I mean, this story has been front page in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Huffington Post, quote, when it comes to illegal drugs, white America does the crime, black America does the time. Here comes a Washington Post. Here's a quote from the Washington Post website. Quote, when you see the crime report next time, you know why the stats are black. Crime occurs at the same or higher rates in other communities, but the policing and prosecution is much higher in the black communities. Okay, so, but to get to that thing, you have to go down, 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 keep pulling threads, and ask one question. Ask one question of Cory Booker, John Conyers, Robert Scott, New York Times, Washington Post, and lots of other people. How do we know black people and white people use drugs in the same amount? Where does that come from? Well, Cynthia Tucker, she's the editor, she's a talking head, but she's also the opinion editor at the Atlantic Journal-Constitution. She talks about how, quote, countless studies have shown that black Americans' drug use is in line with our share of the U.S. population. Countless studies? No. There's really only one. She's really only talking about one study. Here's where that study comes from. It comes from the Department of the Census Bureau. How does the Census Bureau know who is smoking pot, who is not, who's using this drug, who is not? You know how they know? They ask. Here's how they ask. I call this the super census. So, all of us fill out that form. We may or may not fill out that form. All of us fill out that form from the Census Bureau answering all these questions. And okay, that's actually in the Constitution. So we fill the form out, send it back. For most of us, that's all there is. But the Census Bureau, they want to dig deeper. And so what they do is they find a number, 4,500 families, and they do what I call the super census. They go into your house, they sit on the couch, and they say, hey, we're from the Census Bureau. And yeah, believe it or not, you actually have to admit us and let us talk to you. Yeah, that's the law. And so what they do is they sit you down, they ask you a lot of questions about, it's all like who we are, how we live, all that good stuff. But the big question they ask, kind of buried in the super census, is a question about your drug use. Do you use drugs? Do you smoke pot? They don't ask you to piss in a bottle. They don't pull your hair out. They don't do anything else. They ask you a question about your potentially illegal behavior, and they want to take your word for it. It's called the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse and Health. And that is where the one number comes from that underlies Cory Booker and everybody else. They ask. That's where the big hoax was born. The hoax that white people and black people use the same amount of drugs. Now, how do we know that? Well, the buzzword for this kind of research, it's called self-reporting. And there's been a lot more research on self-reporting than there has been on actually measuring who uses drugs more, white people or black people. And the great majority of research on self-reporting shows us that self-reporting is not reliable in almost any circumstance. NPR had a story on this a little while ago. They were doing a story, not just self-reporting, but they were doing a story about people who go to church. So they hired a research company and they said, hey, do you go to church? You go, oh, hell yeah, we go to church every Sunday, man. And some crazy number of people said they go to church every Sunday, 25, 35, 50%, 60%. Oh yeah, we go to church, never miss it. So they took these numbers to the local pastor and they said, hey, yeah, we got 60%, all kinds of people say they're going to church. What do you think about that every Sunday? Pastor said, oh no, that's not even close to being true. So what they did is they actually went and kind of like monitored the people who said they were going to church. Turned out a whole bunch of people said they were going to church when they were not. That's self-reporting. As you might guess, there's also lots of self-reporting studies on how reliable is it when people talk about their own drug use. This was like one of the most astonishing things I found when I was writing Don't Make the Black Kids Angry. The astonishing part is how frank the reports are about how often people lie. The astonishing part is they report that there are two main indicators for people lying on self-reporting tests. 1, are you recently out of prison? And 2, are you African American? Why don't we go through some of these self-reporting studies? We'll just blow through a paragraph or two at a time of them. Here's one from, they're talking about self-reporting of marijuana and other drug use among black people. A study of 290 African-American men in Baltimore, Maryland, undergoing treatment for hypertension showed that self-reporting of illicit drug use is unreliable. This is a direct quote. Only 48, I think it's called from the Journal of Drug Abuse. Only 48% of the participants reported drug use, but urine drug tests revealed that 131 people had used drugs. I'm sorry, I said 41%, I meant 48. With self-reporting, the drug use among black people was 16%. With testing, it was triple that, 45%. Here's another study from a journal called Addictive Behaviors. Quote, underreporting of cocaine was documented with urine testing validation as well, where African Americans, in comparison to Caucasians who were urine positive, were 6 times more likely to report cocaine use when other factors are controlled for. Translation: when you ask, white people and black people report using cocaine in about the same amount, same time, quantity, and frequency. But when you test, when you're not relying on fairy tales and wishful thinking, black people are 6 times more likely to use cocaine and lie about it. Let's go back to the study for you science junkies, same journal. Quote, the present study also identified predictors of discrepancies between self-report and hair testing. Quote, race was the most salient predictor of cocaine disagreement. So the disagreement they're referring to is the difference between their self-reporting and the actual test. I mean, good Lord, what kind of person basically bases an entire federal policy, this is good old Colin speaking, not the study, on the word of drug addicts about their own drug use? Let's get back to the study. Even when other factors were controlled for, the self-report and hair test results for African American men were more discrepant than for non-African Americans, a finding consistent with past studies. And a large study of youth underreporting of cocaine was documented with urine testing validation as well, where African Americans, in comparison to Caucasians who were urine positive, were 6 times less likely to report cocaine use when other factors are controlled for. It just goes on and on and on. Race is the most salient factor, Senator Booker. I mean, all we could say about drug testing is you don't ask, you check. I mean, if anybody's ever done any public opinion research knows this. So when I was younger, sometimes I'd work on a political campaign. They'd put me on a phone. We'd call people up. And, you'd ask them questions about who they like or don't like. And sometimes you'd ask them other questions like, well, what do you think of the president? And the person would go, the president? Well, I think Harry Truman's doing a good job. He's still the president, right? Listen, I've had this conversation with lots and lots of people who are high-paid political professionals. They are bemoaning the fact that people don't know nothing about nothing. Well, the fact is, people are very, very passionate about their own lives, but maybe less passionate about things that the political professionals want them to be passionate about. Anyway, in that environment, you don't ask people if they voted or not. You look at the voter rolls to see if they voted or not. Because if you ask, we're going to get a voter turnout of like 90%, but if you check, the voter turnout is going to be way, 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 way less than that. So that's the whole Cory Booker story. Everybody claims there are studies. You know, this is like McCarthyism, right? He's standing up on the document. And listen, I don't have any problem with McCarthy naming communists and saying communists were working in our government, but you're not allowed to stand up and hold a bunch of papers saying their names are on the papers and not produce the papers. That's what Cory Booker and everybody else is doing now. So we have reports, we have studies that show that implicit bias is part of our criminal justice system, and as proof of that, white people and black people commit the same amount of crime, blah, blah, blah. But I love it when people use that expression, implicit bias, i.e., bias we can't see or prove. I mean, if we could prove it, it'd be explicit, right? So they're doing the mind reading thing. And, you know, we've talked about the mind reading thing, but it's amazing how they measure implicit bias, too. This is how they do that. It's called, one of the ways they do it is called the symbolic racism test. They ask you basically 5 to 8 questions. And by the way, I've never heard of a black person taking a symbolic racism test. These tests are for white people. And they'll say something like, well, do you believe that anybody can achieve if they work harder? Do you believe African Americans could achieve more if they work harder? Do you believe African Americans are giving special privileges in jobs, in schools, and in other places in life through affirmative action? So if you answer these questions truthfully, that is a sign, an indicator that you are a racist. That's implicit racism. Basically being a conservative who doesn't believe in collectivism, who believes in individual effort, who believes in individual achievement, who doesn't believe in identity politics, is, by their definition, by the definition of lots and lots of people who write lots and lots of books and who teach in very big and incredible universities, will tell you essentially that if you're a conservative and you answer those questions like that, you are racist. And this judge didn't want to push back on that. Cory Booker was incredulous that the judge didn't know about implicit racism. So what did the judge? Was the judge too cowardly to speak up? Was he ignorant? Did the same people who prepared Betsy DeVos, were they the ones whispering in his ear, stay away from the whole racial thing because that's not something we want to be involved in? So there's just going to be targets from now on. Nobody's going to push back. Nobody's going to tell the truth. Nobody's going to say we have an enormous problem in this country with black criminality wildly out of proportion. And people like Cory Booker are lying about it. Yes, I use the word lie. I think I'll light up a cigar here. Hold on. So what do you guys know about Cory Booker? I was a little surprised Cory Booker was not on the national ticket during the last election. One thing we learned during the Obama administration is we learned how much black people and their white enablers are seeing the entire world through the lens of white racism. And the lesson of 2016, which I actually talked about, long before the election, for a year running up to the election, is that black people are just not that much into white people. And Obama raised the bar. They weren't going to accept any substitutes anymore. Black people figure out if they're going to vote 93% for Democrats, well, they want a Democrat on the ticket before they get all fired up about it. That's one of the things that happened to Hillary. It wasn't that black people didn't vote for Trump. They didn't. They just stayed home. That's how she lost Philly, Cleveland, and places like that. She didn't have enough black people voting for her. So she picked Tim Kaine, and Tim Kaine was, he's known. It's weird. This Tim Kaine, his big claim to fame, he goes to an African-American Roman Catholic church. He thought he was going to get some brownie points from the fellas and their lovely ladies for that when they could not have cared less. I mean, I didn't invent this game of identity politics. We expose it here. But it's funny, the Democrats, they're the ones pushing it. But at a very crucial moment, they decided they didn't have to play it anymore. They set the rules. Then they tried to kind of like suspend the rules for Hillary. That did not work. Maybe one reason Cory Booker was not on the national ticket was the story of T-Bone. Now, this story I'm about to tell you in my book is crazier than the Elizabeth Warren story. So without going back and looking at Wikipedia, Cory Booker, here's what I know about Cory Booker. I think he went to Yale. Boy, it's amazing how many people come out of Yale Law School and basically don't do anything good with their lives. Anyway, so he went to Yale, and then he moved down to Newark, New Jersey. Of course, the big thing about people, what they whisper about Cory in Newark is that he spent more time in Manhattan during the entire time than Newark. So anyway, Cory's running for office. He runs for city council. I think the way it worked, he ran for city council, he lost, then he won, then he became mayor, then he became U.S. senator. But during a good chunk of the time he was running for office as a city councilman and a mayor, he told the story of T-Bone. He told the story hundreds of times. How he moved to Newark, and he was kind of let's face it, Cory Booker's not a street kid. No street cred. So he moves into this black hood, and the first thing he did is, he was kind of getting the vibe that he says, all this, okay, spoiler alert, everything I'm about to tell you is like not true about Cory's story. So he comes and he starts saying to people, he tells people that he met a guy named T-Bone. T-Bone was like this, he's kind of like the good-hearted gangster type criminal, right? He goes out and robs and kills and does this other stuff to people, but he actually has a heart of gold. And he responded to Cory Booker when Cory Booker kind of laid out the hand of friendship across this wide divide of growing up and this and that. So he tells the story of T-Bone, how T-Bone taught him the streets, how T-Bone taught him this, how used to ride around together, and everybody loved the story of T-Bone. Told the story how T-Bone, National Review broke the story. If you want to look it up, just go T-Bone, Cory Booker, National Review, and there's a big thing in there, all the details of the story of T-Bone. But that National Review basically said, listen, this guy T-Bone doesn't exist. And they pointed out consistencies. They talked to Cory's friends, and they pretty much said, oh yeah, well, maybe it's a composite. Maybe only a little bit's true. Maybe none of it's true. Maybe he made the whole damn thing up. So we get Elizabeth Warren telling people she's an Indian, and because she has high cheekbones and she publishes plagiarized recipes in Indian cookbooks, I should say Native American. And there's Cory basically inventing his life story to get street cred with black people in Newark so he can get elected mayor. Is that crazy? On a scale of 1 to 10, how crazy is that? And so a lot of people knew this story. And so my only question is, when she picked Kane, did she know the story of T-Bone? Did she know this was going to be a completely embarrassing story? I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that T-Bone is a total fiction, and I don't even know if Cory Booker came to believe in T-Bone as a real person. I mean, isn't that the definition of a sociopath, a person that believes his own lies? So there's this guy lying about T-Bone, lifting his chin in the air, doing the virtue display, yelling at this potential judge because he doesn't know the numbers. I'm shocked you don't know the numbers. And people don't bust him on this? Oh, you think this is the only Cory Booker story we've got? There's one that's it's even crazier in its own way. And so one of the things that Barack Obama found when he moved to Chicago, he found, and his political consultant kind of specialized in this. What's his name? The guy used to have the mustache who shaved it off. I forget. Axelrod. Axelrod used the same model for Deval Patrick to become the governor of Massachusetts. He knew there was an enormous reservoir of sympathy and hope and eagerness among white people to see black people make it good. So here comes Barack Obama, here comes Deval Patrick onto the scene with no visible signs. What did Joe Biden call him? He called him clean and articulate. What did Harry Reid say? He doesn't speak with a Negro dialect. That's the formula. All the Democrats know the formula. And so so Cory Booker knows the formula as well as anybody. And so he's trying to follow the formula of being the next great black hope for the white liberals and the white people who are just desperate to see black people make something out of themselves in this country. One of the people he found who was desperate to see Cory Booker succeed, one of the people he found that was desperate to see not just Cory succeed, but a whole city succeed, was Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. So Cory, to his credit, I guess, I mean, he's hanging around with people you and I aren't hanging around with in Manhattan. He's hanging around with the people who run the country. He's talking to them, like Mark Zuckerberg. And so Zuckerberg comes up with an idea that, you know what, the only thing preventing Newark School, the school district, the only thing holding black people back is education. The only thing holding back education in Newark is money. So why don't I give you $100 million and we are going to lift Newark out of the mire and the muck, this enormous level of dysfunction that's caused only by one thing, the level of white racism that doesn't give the adequate resources to people in Newark. And once we do that, then we're going to use that as a model. We're going to use that as proof positive that Cory Booker and all these other people are right, that what the implicit bias, the explicit bias is just a fact of life. And we know that because once we cure the bias with a whole bunch of money, that will be our proof. That's what Zuckerberg did. Why don't we hear a little interview with somebody who wrote a book about that. She's going to talk about where the money went and what happened to the money.
I'm Dale Rosikoff. I'm a journalist, and I'm the author of Prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools. So I spent 4.5 years working on the book, reporting it and writing it, beginning literally the day that Zuckerberg's gift was announced on the Oprah show. The book tells the story of the $100 million gift, how he came to give it, and the forces that it unleashed, both intended and unintended. I felt I could tell a story that was really the true story of what the education reform movement is about and what it's running up against. And I thought it would be an opportunity to get away from the polarization that has just completely overtaken the discussion of education and try to get to a level where everybody could just accept that this is the truth of what's happening.
So you write that in the beginning, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and then Mayor Cory Booker set out not just to fix Newark schools, but to create a national model for how to turn around an entire school district. How far did they actually come, and what is at the heart of what went wrong?
The bottom line is they didn't come very far. I don't think anybody would say that the Newark School District is now a model. And I think that thinking that way was part of the problem. I don't think that education in any city is something that you can bring a model to and fix it. It's a very human, granular, history-based challenge. And to see it as something that you can have a startup model that you can create a proof point and then scale up nationally is just a complete misconception. As you said, Zuckerberg pledged this $100 million to the Booker Christie cause, given that city officials raised a matching amount. Where did that money go, and is it making a difference in students' lives? Almost $50 million went to the teachers' contract. The idea was to make teachers more accountable. After 4 years, it's pretty hard to see the effects of that. And the question of whether that will have long-term effects is just an open one. And $25 million went to expanding charter schools. I mean, I think you can say that some of the money is having an impact on kids. The fact that charter schools expanded and that some of those charter schools are excellent is good for kids. And then the rest of the money went in lots of directions. There was $20 million that went to the work of consultants who received, in general, $1,000 a day for carrying out various management reform efforts within the district. There was this notion that consultants had the answers and you could hire this expertise and pay for it at enormous prices on the assumption that this was going to bring the magic answer, the silver bullet to Newark. And it was an enormous amount of money that went towards something that really didn't have a lot of returns.
What is the significance of the title, the prize?
The prize ended up having many meanings to me. I learned very early on that people who had been in Newark for generations talked about the Newark school district budget as the prize. The district budget in Newark is the biggest public budget in the city. At the time that the reformers arrived, there were 7,000 employees. The patronage politicians, the political bosses, and of course the elected officials, they all wanted to control the Newark public schools because with that money they could enhance their own power. But then there was another meaning of the prize, which was the way Cory Booker, Chris Christie, and Mark Zuckerberg talked about their reform effort in Newark. And I saw the children and their right to an education as the ultimate prize. So I saw it as a term with many meanings, one for the old urban machine politics that had always controlled district schools, one for the reform movement that wanted to reshape district schools, and one for the children who are the ultimate prize. The subtitle is Who's in Charge of America's Schools? I think the prize is what all of those forces will keep fighting for.
So here's what happened to the money, just to summarize what she said. $100 million, $50 million right away to give teachers more money, to give more money to the teachers' union. In theory, they would attract better teachers. In theory, would get rid of the dirtballs who are teaching and doing a lousy job. Did that happen? No, it didn't happen. Nobody was getting fired. Nobody was getting promoted. It was the exact same system, except the people who were screwing up the system before just made a lot more money doing it now with the help of Zuckerberg. And then they spent $25 million on basically starting charter schools and firing up some charter schools, things like that. Then they give $25 million to the consultants to come in, working for $1,000 a day, patting on everybody on the head, saying, rah, 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 we're going to turn this around. We're going to show those no good SOBs like Colin Flaherty that, this white racism really exists. It's holding back black people. And Mark Zuckerberg is going to change the world with his $100 million. Nothing happened. If you look hard, maybe you could see a study or two that said the English scores bumped up. I mean, they were kind of rock bottom before. Math scores, nothing happened there. This was just, instead of the federal government coming in and backing up cement trucks full of money into Newark to help with the schools, it was Mark Zuckerberg doing it. Nothing happened. She kind of obliquely referred to it. The person we just heard, she obliquely referred to it in other places. She talks about the machine politics. She talks about the labor unions. And this is, Newark's a chocolate city. I mean, no matter what you see on The Sopranos, which was kind of based in Newark, they weren't backing the cement trucks up into Tony Soprano's back swimming pool and dumping the cash in there. No. This money went to black people, black organizations, black students, black schools, and nothing happened. Wow. That's Cory Booker. I guess we have to mention Chris Christie. He was in on it too. But when these guys did that, when they began, I mean, they were doing a magical mystery tour all around the country. Ellen DeGeneres. Yeah, we're going to finally get this figured out, get it straightened out. Damn it. Then all of a sudden it just disappeared. And I was up in... where was I? I was up in that neck of the woods. I think I was with an Uber driver. I don't know why I was going through Newark. I'm sure I was on my way to New York. And they brought it up. They go, yeah, whatever happened to the Uber driver was saying, yeah, whatever happened to all the money? Nobody knows. Well, nothing happened. That's the point. I mean, have you seen them on Ellen? Have you seen them sitting on the couch of the Today Show? Have you seen them pronouncing that, all this stuff got better, all the test scores got better, all the black people in Newark are now getting good jobs because all the black teachers, all the black administrators, all the black people who run Newark, who got their beak wet, they're now doing a great job. Oh, man, what a mess. That's Cory Booker. And see, Here's one quality about people I don't really understand that much. Listen, I understand everybody has failings, okay? I get that. But if you have a failing, I mean, shouldn't that make, especially as you get a little older, shouldn't that make you at least a little more humble? If you're, and couldn't we at least expect you're not going to be lecturing people from a position of moral superiority about the same thing you failed in, but you tried to turn the failure into a success? All of a sudden, you are explaining to this judge the way the world works. That's Cory Booker. He just goes around giving speeches, never gets challenged. Federal judge wouldn't challenge him. Good Lord, what's going to happen when people take a case into his court on affirmative action? Are we going to get another judge like Sandra Day O'Connor? How many years ago was it when they had a pure affirmative action case in front of the Supreme Court? It was decided 5-4. O'Connor was the fifth vote. It was at University of Texas, University of Michigan, race-based admissions in a college. Sandra Day O'Connor said, well, we can't, we can't get rid of these now because it's going to take 25 years to get rid of the problem. It's getting close to 25 years. Has anything gotten better? No. What's changed is we're playing racial identity politics more and more and more and more. And Cory Booker is sitting on the sidelines, stoking the flames with this fake resume, this fake credibility, this fake claim to be the new leader of all the black people. Oh, by the way, there's not one single black leader who doesn't fit that description I just gave to you. Playing this crazy little con game of racial identity politics, which Cory Booker hopes is going to send him into the White House without ever anybody asking him about T-Bone. I mean, how long did Elizabeth Warren go before somebody seriously started asking her questions about, Pocahontas? Maybe Cory's story of T-Bone will get Trump's attention one day, once Cory starts raking over more and more of Trump's people for their implicit racism. God, I love that word, implicit racism. We can't, Your Honor, we want you to find that dude guilty of racism and racial practices, but it's implicit. We really can't prove it. We can't see it, but we just kind of know it's there because we are mind readers, Your Honor. Trump is not a person that lets people wail on him, as everybody here knows. He's not a person that lets people wail on him without him firing back. Yet in the last week, there's been two members of the opposition party in the media and the Democratic Party wailing on his people. Nobody firing back. How long is that going to last? Are there people in the White House going, "Hey, man, let's we can't really oppose this"? Because telling the truth about these fairy tales they confronted Betsy DeVos with, telling the truth about the fairy tales they confronted this judge with, we can't do that because that's just going to make too many black kids angry.